Daniel J. Lewis here from the Audacity to Podcast.com, answering your podcasting questions live. I do this on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time over at the Audacity to Podcast.com/live. If you want to send your questions in advance, then please send a concise question to feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com. And you can also post in the chat room if you're watching this live on Facebook on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. So I got some fun questions to answer. First question from Michael Delaney. If big money gets into podcasting, into the podcasting world, do you see the FCC trying to tell podcasters what they can and cannot do? Well, already there are some rules that we have to follow, at least in the United States, and some general good practices to follow, such as disclosures. Like if you are making money from a product, or you've been paid to review a product, or a product has been provided to you, or a service or something like that, where you've gotten it for free when you otherwise would have paid for it, then according to Federal Trade Commission rules, not Federal Communication Commission or whatever FCC stands for, but according to FTC rules, you do need to disclose that. If it's a paid review, paid product placement, basically, if you are paid for something, whether it's an affiliate link, a sponsorship, a review unit, if you've been compensated in any way, you do need to disclose that. And at least that's according to United States Federal Trade Commission rules. That will probably be pretty similar for other countries as well. In general, I think it's just a good ethical practice that if you're paid for something, paid to do something or to produce any particular kind of content, or you've been compensated in some way for something that you're doing in your podcast, I think it's just good ethical guidelines to disclose that so that people don't think, oh, you're recommending this genuinely, and then realize, oh, you were only paid to recommend it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be genuine in recommending something that you happen to get paid for, but that's all about the reputation of integrity that you've built up to that point, to ensure that people trust you. So when you say, I do recommend this, here's my affiliate link for it, people know then that you're not recommending it only because you have an affiliate link for it, but because your reputation is, you've tried this, you know you're going to follow it. But other aspects of this, you said, will the FCC then try to tell podcasters what they can and cannot do? Maybe, but I think that podcasts would be low on the priority list. And there are other ways to enforce certain rules, content guidelines, moral standards, however you want to define it. There are plenty of ways to enforce those kind of rules without the FCC even getting involved. For example, YouTube. Your freedom of speech on YouTube has not been hindered recently. Although there is this thing that I think people have called the YouTube adpocalypse, where YouTube has been demonetizing a bunch of videos. And that's not saying you are not allowed to publish this content on our platform, although they do have that right to say that. And that's something we always need to keep in mind. And when you're submitting your podcast to places, or when you're posting your content on particular platforms, they have a terms of service, most likely. You've agreed to that. And that terms of service could say something like, we don't allow this content, or we reserve the right to remove content from our platform if we find that it violates our community guidelines. So it's totally possible that YouTube could decide, hey, guess what? We're going to be the anti-Christian video network. So any video that promotes Christianity in any way, we're going to completely delete from our platform. As horrible and as Christophobic as that would be, it is something that they're allowed to do because it is their private owned platform. Now, there are guidelines and stuff that go into that, but all that to say, there are other things that might affect your content first. Apple Podcasts, YouTube, your web hosting company, your media host, all of these places may have certain terms of service that if you violate those in some way based on either the kind of content you create or some other thing that you're doing, you could get kicked off that platform. Now, that doesn't mean you're not allowed to podcast. That doesn't mean you're not allowed free speech. It simply means you're not allowed to have that speech on their privately owned platform. It's like the difference between what you say out on the street versus what you're allowed to say inside my home. It's not an issue of freedom of speech. It's an issue of where is the appropriate place to share that. And I think that the FCC would probably, if they're going to impose any kind of restrictions, it would be on kinds of things, kind of like the FTC requires with those disclosures for when you're compensated in some way. That's one thing they would probably impose. The other thing would be maybe some language guidelines, kind of like there are language guidelines on broadcast media. And there are other things like on the internet, adult-related content and such, sexually related content, pornographic stuff on the internet, and certain guidelines there. With podcasts, it's still a little bit different because it's not openly broadcast to the world. This is one of the reasons why on cable, you can have certain things that you can't have on regular broadcast television. Not only are the rules different, but one of the reasons why those rules, I think, are different is because one is openly broadcast. Anyone could get that signal with the right gear, versus the other, you have to be a subscriber to it. And by being a subscriber, then you're under certain different terms of service. So podcasts are openly available to everyone, but they're decentralized in their publication. And that's one of the reasons why I named my podcast The Audacity to Podcast, is that it's kind of this idea of pirate radio, not in the unethical sense or that we're stealing anything from anyone, but that we as the independent content creators can share a message with the world, and we can build a platform of our own. We don't need big media. We don't need someone else's distribution platform in order to find our own audience. It's very decentralized. So for the FCC to come in and start regulating things, I don't think that they will, or if they were to start regulating things, I think it would be some kind of much broader appeal, like what can blogs say, since there are so many more blogs and websites than there are podcasts, as well as they might make some kind of blanket statement that covers all of internet content. So if it's available over the internet, then it must follow these guidelines. But I really can't see that happening. Nonetheless, as long as you do everything above board and you don't go into dangerous territory or unethical territory, then I don't think you have anything to worry about. Mark Burdge asked, what's the best way to take live calls for a podcast? First thing, if you're going to do something live, because if you're going to take live calls, then people need to be able to listen live or watch live. So the first thing is whether you can even do a live show. Do you have the personal presentation and communication and moderating skills to be able to lead a live conversation? Can you do something while distractions are happening in the chat room? Can you moderate the phone calls or screen the phone calls while you're also running a live show? Or do you need someone else to do those call screening things for you? Do you have a large enough audience and a large enough engaged audience that if you wanted to do something live, they would show up and watch or listen live? And more people are switching to time-shifted media consumption. And that's one of the reasons I think podcasts became so popular and caught hold in the early days is, especially for me, it was this idea of I can listen to this whenever. I don't have to miss anything. I don't have to be there at just the right moment. Yes, a lot of these shows do live stream, but you can only have an effective live streaming event if your content is engaging. That's what I try to do with these live podcasting Q&As. I'm keeping an eye on the chat room. Like I see that Muhammad posted in there, glad to catch you, with a little smiley face. And if someone posts a question in the chat room, I'll see that and I'll point my attention to it when it's appropriate for me to do so. And when I finished a thought or a section of content, and then I can look over to the chat room, bring something in, and make this engaging content. Back when I was recording the Audacity to Podcast episodes, not engaging, but when I was recording them live streaming the recording, it was a monologue. There really wasn't anything engaging about it. And I didn't have much of an audience. I didn't get much engagement because I was just monologuing. And I know that's what I'm doing here as well because I'm answering questions, but these are questions people have actually sent in. And I'm not reading from a script until I read the actual question, then it's written down for me. And when someone posts a comment in the chat room, I can engage with that. So this can be more engaging content. So can you do a live show? If yes, then let's consider how can you take live phone calls. There are simple ways to do this and complicated ways to do this. blogtalkradio.com, and I have an affiliate link for them if you're interested, theaudacitypodcast.com/blogtalkradio. They're probably the best at handling live call-ins. Their live streaming quality isn't really all that good, but their live calling ability and the screening abilities there are really good. You can have someone else screening the calls for you and then send them over to you that you can see a screen, or you can see on your screen that so-and-so is calling, they have such and such comment, whatever. So it can be easy for you to get someone else on your team to help you out or a volunteer. They don't even have to be in the same room with you. They could be somewhere else in the world helping you moderate your calls. There is also Call-In Studio, which I believe is callinstudio.com. It's a similar kind of service that lets you do live call-ins like that with screening and such. And if you're using those tools to handle the live stream as well, then that will send that live audio out to your audience as well as record it. Now, if you want something that's more tool or platform independent, something that you can control more, then you have a whole bunch of other options to do this. First, you need a way to accept a phone call and bring it into your audio. So that could be as simple as your actual phone. It could be Google Voice, which forwards to your phone. It could be Skype. It could be something you answer on your computer, some kind of voice over IP system that makes you, lets you get or send a phone call through your computer. However your phone call is coming in, it then needs to be mixed together with your microphone and your audio for the live stream. And when we're talking about mixing audio, that's when you need a mixer. So on a mixer, you'd want to look up how to do a mix minus, which is sending the mix of everything like your sound effects, your voice, your co-host voice, anything else you're playing, sends that mix minus the person's own voice. It sends all of that back to them. So they're not hearing an echo of themselves, but they're hearing you. The simplest way to do this is use a phone, use the audio jack on your phone, or if you have a newer device that doesn't have the audio jack built into the phone, use the adapter that came with your smart device and use a TRRS, that's with two R's in the middle, TRRS splitting adapter, and you'll be able to plug that into your microphone or into your phone and then also plug it into your mixer. The yellow line is usually the microphone to the phone line, so that would be the output from your mixer. And then the red and white lines would be the audio from the phone going into your mixer. The other way that you could do it is run a simple regular TRS, like a stereo audio cable from your phone into your mixer. And that takes the audio from your caller, puts it into your mixer, but then your caller would only hear you through the microphone on your device. That can work when it's only one person and you don't have sound effects, you don't have anything like that. People need to be able to hear other than your own voice. And you could set the phone out on your desk, on a surface, and you would be talking into the phone. It wouldn't be the best call quality for your listener. For your live audience and for the recording, it might be fine. So that device could be your smartphone. It could be another computer. It could be the main computer you're working with. You just need to have that ability to separate their voice from what you send them, so they're not hearing an echo of themselves. And then you might need to have some kind of tap out, whether that's through your headphones or the main mix from your mixer that goes out to your live stream, so your live audience can see or hear everything that they're supposed to. Robinson asked, is it possible to record, edit, and post a podcast entirely on an iPhone? Yes, it is. Now, you mentioned edit, and that is the odd one out in this, but I'll mention that in a moment. You can record a podcast entirely on an iPhone fairly easily, like even with audio mix-ins with sound effects and such, using GarageBand. It's called BossJock Studio. Great app for iOS, either iPad or iPhone, that lets you live mix these things in. You can plug in an external microphone, you can load sound effects, sound clips and stuff onto that, and it will live mix everything together, and then you have your final MP3 file. And you can even then upload from there to your media host, Libsyn, Blueberry, an FTP server, anything like that. For editing, though, that is the harder one out. So you might need a recording app and an editing app, or it might even be possible that your editing app can record as well. So there are programs out there. There's Multitrack DAW, D-A-W. That's for, I believe that's only for iPad. But there are some other apps that allow you to do some basic editing. You could even use GarageBand on your iOS device to edit and record the things. And then once you get that MP3 file, all you have to do is upload that to your service. So it might be through the app itself. It has some kind of publishing platform. It could be through some other app on your iOS device, like an FTP app or something else, or even just through the web browser, that you're able to then upload that MP3 file that you have to your media host and publish from there. So yes, it is possible to record, edit, and post a podcast entirely from an iPhone. Is it ideal? Maybe, maybe not. Because you have to think about things like audio quality, and you can get good microphones. The microphone built into the iPhone is pretty good. You can get some external microphones that plug in, whether lav mics, studio mics. There's actually a mic that is just out of my reach, but there's a microphone that Sennheiser just finally released a year and a half after they first announced it. It's the Sennheiser Hand Mic Digital. It is a USB, or it's a digital-only microphone, and it can connect to a Lightning port on an iOS device. It's a handheld microphone, very high quality, nice design, nice build quality too. I'll be doing a review about that soon. But there's something like that that can give you really good audio quality directly into your iOS device. You can combine things like a mixer with your iPhone as well if you want to do multiple microphones and get more complicated and such. So recording in is easy, and then taking that recording and publishing it online can also be easy. There might be certain steps along the way, though, depending on which app you like the best. Like maybe, for example, the Meta Recorder, the Apogee Meta Recorder app is probably my favorite app for straight out recording audio on a phone. And I think it can then save that audio as a MP3, maybe. I know it does WAV and AIFF. I'm not sure if it does MP3, but it can't upload to your media host. It can, however, upload to Dropbox. So once you have the file in Dropbox, you might be able to switch over to a different app on your iOS device to then download that WAV file, edit it, convert it to an MP3, and then upload to your media host. Or maybe a separate app then takes the file from Dropbox and uploads it to your media file, to your media host for you. So there might be multiple steps. A single process doesn't exactly exist because of many technical limitations. There are tools like Spreaker, for example, lets you live mix everything, live stream from your phone. You hit stop on the recording and streaming, and it publishes directly to your podcast RSS feed. That's probably the easiest solution there is out there for podcasting from your iOS device, but you can't edit. Now, what you could maybe do is download that file, edit it, and then re-upload it or replace the file that's on Spreaker. But that's what I'm saying. There's no completely inclusive workflow. Just like on desktop computers, there's no completely inclusive workflow. Your editing software can record, yes, but it most likely doesn't publish directly to your podcast media host and publish the podcast for you. You still have to use other tools. So that's the thing, is just using multiple tools to do what they do best on your device. John Hagedorn asked, how can we as podcasters generate more loyalty from fans with regard to sponsor support? The question's a little unclear to me, so I'm going to answer it in two different ways. The first is generating more loyalty what you said, from fans with regard to sponsor support. So first way I'll answer this is the kind of loyalty you want from your fans that then you'll show your sponsors, because that can be very powerful. It's sometimes even more powerful than the raw numbers to show a sponsor, instead of simply saying, hey, look, I have this many downloads or this many people in my audience. You might be able to instead say, look how engaged my audience is. Look at the kind of audience that I have. Ways that you can do that are collecting feedback, collecting praise from your audience, collecting your podcast reviews from mypodcastreviews.com. These are ways that you can show how engaged your audience is with your relevant content. Now, the other way around is if you want loyalty in the sense, or you want to leverage that loyalty to support the sponsors, then first of all, you have to know what your audience needs and what's relevant for your podcast. You'll hear me talk about this in my episode of the Audacity to Podcast publishing on October 17th, which is really interesting episode, I think. It's podcasting lessons from a binge listener, a really long Apple podcast review that I received, where this person listened to all of my episodes and then had certain interesting feedback that you would not get except from someone who binged on so much content in such a short time, and some great constructive criticism that came from that. So in there, I mentioned that when you want to share something with your audience, a product, a sponsor and such, just because your audience will use it and you use it doesn't mean it's a good product. Consider this. I'll say most of us wear shoes. I do live in Kentucky, so I can't say all of us, especially around here. And I'm allowed to say that because I'm from Kentucky. Well, I live in Kentucky. I'm not from here. I live here. So I can joke about the locals. But most of us wear shoes. I wear shoes. You probably wear shoes too. So in my podcast about podcasting, should I have a shoe company as a sponsor? Because shoes are relevant to me and to my audience. No, I shouldn't. Because my audience isn't coming to me to learn about shoes. They're coming to me to learn about podcasting. So if I'm telling them about shoes they should try, it's not going to stick as well. It's like when random people give you parenting advice. How much do you really trust what they share? Or how much do you want to try to implement that advice, that unsolicited advice they gave you? A podcast ad that doesn't fit your podcast and your topic that you cover in your podcast is like that unsolicited advice. Because the commercial that you're doing in your podcast is like an unsolicited piece of advice. Hey, everybody, check out this pair of shoes. Now back to my podcast about podcasting. It doesn't fit. And I've seen in the past when I've recommended things like GoToMeeting, for example, was a sponsor in the early days of the Audacity podcast. I used it. Maybe some of my audience would use it, but it wasn't relevant to podcasting. When I mention things that are relevant to podcasting, they sell. And that's because of that relevance to my subject. Web hosting, for example. I have affiliate relationships with several web hosting companies. And I'll promote these affiliate relationships here and there where appropriate. And they can pay a lot depending on performance. Like some of these companies could pay me $200 or more per referral. And when I mention those companies, people don't buy it. Or most of the time, people don't buy it. That's fine. If I mention a WordPress theme that's great for podcasters, then boy, do people buy that, because it's so much more relevant to my subject, which then makes it automatically relevant to my audience. So if you have a sponsor and you want your audience to remain loyal to you and express some of that loyalty by supporting your sponsor, make sure that sponsor fits your content. And there are times when you might think it fits well, but it doesn't really. Like, for example, we have a we have a couple productivity podcasts on our podcast network, Noodle.mx network over at Noodle.mx. And you might think, oh, productivity podcast, fantastic opportunity for a company like Basecamp or Asana or Trello or these different project management companies. Well, we've done that, we've experimented with it, and we discovered that that often didn't perform really well. Why is that? Well, because people are listening to those podcasts to learn how to be more productive, not what kind of tools they should use. Maybe they already have a tool, and it's not a matter of picking the right tool. I mean, we even have a podcast called Beyond the To-Do List, and it's not about the to-do list or what you use to make that to-do list. It's about the mindset. So project management software as a sponsor on those podcasts might not make sense sometimes. So you have to think about what is relevant to your topic. And by making it relevant to your topic, you're making it relevant to your audience, and your audience will express their loyalty and will appreciate that relevance. But if you're doing something that's completely irrelevant to your topic, even if it's relevant to your audience, like selling socks or shoes, then it's possible your audience might feel like you're selling out, even though what you're recommending is totally relevant to every human being. Do you like oxygen? Here, buy this bottle of oxygen. That might not go over so well with your audience. Isaac Hurst said, if I were to use a short news clip, 30 seconds or so, from a news station, such as CNN, and then discussed the topic they were talking about in the news clip, would that be in any way copyright infringement? And he continues saying, I would essentially be using their clip to introduce the topic for discussion. My podcast is a public podcast with over 1,000 listens a week. We currently do not make any money out of it, but might start getting some advertisers, in which case we would be generating a very low revenue. Well, whether you make money from the podcast has really nothing to do with whether something could be copyright infringement. The only thing that might affect is how big the penalties are. For example, if you're making millions of dollars and it's copyright infringement, then a court's probably going to go after you for millions or billions of dollars. If you've made no money, the court can still go after you for damages, but they're going to see that, well, you didn't make money from this, or you didn't try to make money. That aside, though, the copyright issue is so complicated. There's no hard guideline. There's like even 30 seconds. There is no 30-second rule to say you can use 30 seconds of anything you want, and that's free of copyright infringement. There is no such rule. When I first looked at this question, I asked our copyright expert inside of Podcaster Society, Gordon Firemark, I asked him about an idea I had for some kind of rule of thumb that we could apply to this, because I thought, oh, this might be a good way to apply it. And he said, well, no, unfortunately, it can't be that simple, because there are all kinds of factors that go into this, like how much of the copyrighted work are you using, how much of that copyrighted work is, or how much of your content is that copyrighted work. Like if you have a 90-second podcast and 60 seconds of it are copyrighted content, that kind of thing. How is the work being used? All kinds of things that go into it. So if you want to be covered under fair use, it's very tricky, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving actual legal advice. Definitely seek an actual lawyer for specifics. Some general guidelines you could think about and consider, and then figure out what's right for you, is how is it that you're using that clip? Now, you said that your short news clip would then be kind of like the springboard for your discussion. So you are creating content inspired by that news clip. Now, the majority of the content is yours, but how are you using the news clip? Like, does the news clip introduce the topic for you and then you talk about the topic? That might be copyright infringement, because that's kind of like if I were to use copyrighted music as my segue into a section where I talk about something. But if you are discussing the actual coverage of the news, so you're discussing what's actually said in that clip, how that clip was covered, if you are critiquing what's in that clip, if you are commenting on it. You're reviewing their coverage of the news. Like No Agenda podcast, for example, from the actual podfather, Adam Curry. He helped create podcasting, helped make podcasting a thing. And John C. Dvorak do this podcast twice a week, 3 hours per episode. I listen to all of their episodes except for the last bit because I don't like techno remixes. But in their podcast, they have lots of news clips. And they're not so much, well, they are often commenting about the story, but they're also commenting on the coverage of the story. So if you are commenting on the actual clip you're using, then it might be covered under fair use. But I can't give you a straight yes and no answer. You really need to talk to a lawyer to get the specifics in your case. But whatever you do, proceed with caution. And as much as possible, I always recommend try not to use copyrighted content at all, because then there's no infringement whatsoever. But if you do need to use it, be very, very careful and make sure that you are talking about the actual content. You're not merely using it as a springboard for your own content. Mike Wilkerson in the chat said, seek a lawyer, yes, but when in doubt, go original/buy your clips/music and details. Having the "see, I bought it" paper in hand is such a giant peace of mind. It is. To be able to hold up that paper and say, we've got a bill of sale right here, right here, right here. Let that one sit until you try and remember, where'd that come from? Oh yeah, I remember. Peter Wood said, will my feed be the same even though I'm on a different server? Possibly. It really depends on what you mean by different server and how you've migrated. For example, if you had Bluehost, which is owned by a Chinese conglomerate called EIG, and that's why I no longer recommend Bluehost and a lot of other web hosting companies. But anyway, if you have a website on Bluehost and you migrate that site off of Bluehost over to SiteGround, if you want to sign up with my affiliate link, theaudacitytopodcast.com/SiteGround. So it's the same website, same domain, same content, same URLs, all of that, simply on a different server. Then your feed will be the same. There are some cases where maybe you're switching from a Linux server to a Windows server, or vice versa, from a Windows server to a Linux server. In such cases, the software that's running the server may function a little bit differently, and so your URL might be different. Like, for example, running WordPress on a Windows server is kind of annoying. One of the things it might do, depending on how the server is configured, is as part of your URLs would be this index.php early on in the URL, and that can be really annoying to see in there. And that's a Windows server kind of thing, usually, when you see that. There are ways to work around that, and Linux, though, makes hosting WordPress a lot easier. Now, if you're talking about you're generating your RSS feed with your media host, like Libsyn, and then you are moving over to Blueberry as your media host and to create your RSS feed, then your feed will be different. But in such cases, whenever your feed is different, the feed URL, you can set a redirect, so that any request for that old one goes to the new one. It's kind of like a change of address at the post office. You say anything that comes in for this address needs to be forwarded to this new address and notify the sender that it's a permanent change of address. There could be some other fringe cases depending on what you're talking about, but I think that will probably, what I just mentioned, address most of the issues you may face. Bijay said, one thing I'm not confident about podcasting is the flow of editing any podcast episode. I use Audacity, and my editing workflow looks like this. Number 1, import Skype recorded guest audio and my audio recorded on Audacity. Number 2, clear background noise, ahas, ums, and pauses. Number 3, the peaks from my guest are very broad, hence I compress them normally 3 to 1 and normalize my part to -1 decibel. Number 4, I do some bass boost or cut or some polishing by equalization. Number 5, add intro and outro. Number 6, export as AIFF, which is kind of like Wave, by the way. Number 7, use levelator to match loudness. Number 8, import back to Audacity. And number 9, finally export as MP3. He said, the final audio I get is not as I desire it to be, and I feel I am making some mistakes. So can you please share what does an ideal editing workflow look like? Well, when we're talking about audio quality, the biggest thing that affects your audio quality is your technique and your environment. That's even more important than the actual microphone that you use. You could use a $300 microphone. You could use a $2,000 microphone. But if you're recording in a stadium during a football game, you're not going to get very good audio quality. So that super expensive fancy microphone isn't giving you the audio quality that you want in that case because of the environment. Also, you could take that same $2,000 microphone, put it on the other side of the room, or put it a couple feet away from you by setting it on your desk, and then you have all this distance between you and the microphone. You could do that and also still get bad audio quality because you're so far away from the microphone. The microphone picks up a lot more noise when you are farther from it because you're expanding the bubble that it needs to pick up. Instead, get close to the microphone, turn down the gain as necessary, so then it's more sensitive to your voice since your voice is much closer to it. It's kind of like the difference between my standing in a crowd and yelling at you versus my coming and whispering into your ear when I'm right next to you. You'll hear me a lot better when I'm closer, regardless of the actual volume level or distance of the other sounds. If I'm closer, you'll probably hear me better. And that's the same way microphones work. There's none of this stuff about condenser versus dynamic microphones and background noise or distance noise. That's all myth or misconception, which I will have an episode very soon about that because I find more and more people talking about that from the myth and misconception perspective. So have good technique and a good environment. That will make a huge difference in the quality of your recording because you can get decent audio, pretty good audio, with good technique and a good environment, but a cheap microphone. And your audio gear that you use is also important. So yes, when you have the right technique and the right environment, you will get better results on a better microphone. Now, if you compare something like the ATR 2100 USB, which is about a $60 microphone, to something like the RE320, a $300 microphone, you will hear a difference, and I would say that the RE320 sounds better, but is it a $300 difference? Maybe, maybe not. Is it worth it to you? Maybe, maybe not. I see a lot of very successful podcasters using that $60 microphone that actually they were fortunate enough to pay only $35 for during one of those insane price drops on the microphone years ago. Podcastingdeals.com, by the way. If you ever want to know when there's a great deal on some podcasting gear, sign up over at podcastingdeals.com. And when the ATR 2100 USB goes on sale, believe me, an email goes out about that. So in your workflow, I do see some unnecessary steps. So let's assume you get wonderful sounding audio in your raw recording because you've got good technique, a good environment, you have good gear, and with your guest, too, they're close to the microphone. So even if they're talking through Skype, they're using Skype on their mobile device, so the microphone is inches away from their voice instead of feet away, like if they're using the microphone in their webcam or in their laptop computer. So let's assume you get good audio from the beginning. What I would recommend, looking at your processes, you could cut out several steps from this process. The first thing is record in WAV or AIFF. This is uncompressed audio, so you can edit it, save it over and over and over and over and over, and it doesn't decrease the audio quality. Whereas MP3, every time you resave it, does decrease the audio quality a little bit because it's recompressing it. It won't affect it so badly if you're recompressing it at really high bit rates, like 320 kilobits per second, but then you're just wasting time, really, if you're recompressing it, because it does take the time to do that. So you mentioned clear background noise, you mentioned the loudness levels, you mentioned some EQ, you mentioned adding the intro and outro. What I recommend is replace Levelator with Auphonic, AUPHONIC. You can use the online version and you get up to 2 hours of audio processing per month for free, or you can pay certain credits to get even more hours than that, or just outright buy the software and you can run it on your computer so that you get the ability to not even have to upload. You can process everything right there on your computer, unlimited amount of audio, and you don't have to wait for uploads and downloads. Auphonic does a much better job at leveling the loudness of your audio, and it can do the compression for you, which is part of kind of the leveling. That's more about evening out the differences. And it can also do a pretty good job at removing background noise. So Auphonic can replace multiple steps in this process for you. So what I would recommend is when you're doing your editing, you've got your raw recordings, run both of your raw recordings through Auphonic to get them cleaned up, get them to the right loudness level. If you have any intro and outro music or bumpers, also run them through Auphonic, but turn off the what do they call it? Well, turn off noise removal, and also turn off the leveler adaptive. What do they call it? Let me just look at Auphonic to see what they call it in their tool. Adaptive leveler, yeah. Turn that off, turn off the noise and hum reduction, turn off high pass filter. If you're processing music, turn all of those things off, because all you need Auphonic to do in that case is put your music to the right audio level. So that way you're working with everything at the right audio level. So you run your audio clips through it, you run your voice recordings that were done with the adaptive leveler, with the noise removal. You run those all through, and if you're processing mono audio, do it to -19 LUFS. If you're doing stereo audio, do -16 LUFS. Then bring it into your audio editing software, edit as necessary, and if you really need to do any kind of polishing with the sound, equalization, you could tweak that a little bit. But keep in mind, if you're raising any of those levels with equalization, that might change the loudness level by a little bit. How much might be negligible. But then you could export directly from your program as MP3. You don't have to export it, process it, re-import it, and back and forth like that. So Auphonic could replace several of these steps in the process for you. That's auphonic.com. I get paid nothing for recommending that. They have no affiliate program. I love the program that much. I trust it a lot, and it does some fantastic work. You could also look at fixmylevels.com. I think I have an affiliate link for them. The audacitypodcast.com/fixmylevels if you want to check it out. From what I've heard from the guy who made it, is the algorithms are a little bit more aggressive than Auphonic. So if you ever feel like what comes out of Auphonic is a bit too aggressive, maybe don't even consider going to fixmylevels.com. But fixmylevels.com is currently free while it's in beta, but it will also eventually be paid. You can experiment with either of those tools, but that can replace several steps in your process. Mike Wilkerson said, found some excellent what the human voice can actually hear reference material recently. But it made me think of a discussion I had with a fellow podcast editor recently. Is the use of WAV a requirement / in any way better than editing out a high-end MP3? Thoughts? We recommend WAV for editing because it is lossless. It's completely uncompressed. So no matter how many times you save it, you will not lose audio quality with each time that you save it. Now, what you do to that file or to that audio, like processes and such, that might be reducing its quality. But that aside, simply saving it does not reduce its quality. So you always know that when you resave WAV, it's in its highest quality possible for that file, that is. WAV can be compressed, like with a zip file and such, and some space saved in certain ways. Now, compare that, though, to an MP3 focused workflow where everything you're doing is in MP3, but it's in high bitrate MP3, like 320 kilobits per second. Now, if you're recording in 320 kilobits per second, you're editing, you're saving, all of this stuff until you make that final file, and then you save it down to your whatever kilobits per second rate that you want for your MP3. You won't lose as much quality. Now, do keep in mind, every time you save, you will lose a little bit. Even though you're saving at 320 kilobits per second, something will be lost. Probably not much, maybe not even noticeable, but something will be lost in that process. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But you might not notice it. Where the real hurt or pain comes in with an MP3-based workflow is the time of things. MP3 has to be encoded and decoded. So if you drag an MP3 into Adobe Audition, it's going to have to decode that. Or if you drag it into Audacity, it will have to decode that. And then in those programs, depending on what you do in those programs, it might have to resave the audio, and it will most likely default to saving it in some kind of uncompressed format like WAV or AIFF or something like that. So there's that time of encoding and decoding. And then every time you save it, by the way, it also has to re-encode it. So that's adding to your workflow time, that you're having to wait for that file to encode to save, whereas a WAV would save much faster, even though it's a much bigger file. And there's also the management of things, because MP3 is not considered a native editing format. It might be that whenever you're dragging it into your editing software, that you're creating a bunch of extra files that are basically WAV copies. So it's kind of an unnecessary step. But if you're looking at it purely from a perspective of audio quality, and you're saving at high bit rates, super high bit rates, 320 kilobits per second, until you make that final MP3, realistically, you're not going to notice a whole lot of difference. And that's why it can often be okay. It can be fine if your particular recording tool can only make an MP3, but it makes a very high quality MP3. That's totally okay, as long as then you encode it properly later on. Last question here, unless something comes up in the chat room. Michael Delaney asked, will Libsyn put stuff on the website, or is this something that you need to do yourself from your own computer? So it depends on what website you're talking about. If you're using Libsyn's website, okay, let's step back. Libsyn as a company will not do that stuff for you. So they're not going to publish it on your website for you. Now, there are certain automation tools inside of Libsyn that you can use depending on your particular workflow that might publish to your website for you. For example, if you use the Libsyn website that they provide, like the Story Behind podcast does, then when you publish on Libsyn, it automatically goes into your Libsyn website. So their system is doing that for you. You don't have to manually do that. If you're using Libsyn to create your RSS feed, but you have your website hosted somewhere else, listen to episode 238 of the Audacity podcast, which will publish a week after I'm recording this video, because in there I talk about some things to look for if you're in that kind of case, especially if you're using your RSS feed from your media host. But if you use Libsyn to create the RSS feed, you use, let's say, WordPress on your own website, by default, Libsyn will not publish from your Libsyn RSS feed over to your website. There are ways to connect it, though. Like you can use the Libsyn on Publish feature, that whenever you publish something on Libsyn, it will publish it over to your WordPress website, but there's no special synchronization there. You could also use the Libsyn plugin for WordPress, and this would be completely instead of PowerPress. PowerPress is really for if you want to create the RSS feed from your own WordPress website. But if you use the Libsyn WordPress plugin, then it does create a synchronization between your WordPress website and Libsyn. So if you publish in Libsyn, it synchronizes to your website. If you publish on your website, it synchronizes to Libsyn. If you have something other than WordPress, like Squarespace or something like that, then when you create content in your Libsyn feed, it will not automatically publish over to your site. So it really depends on what are the tools you're using, what is the particular workflow you're going through. It might be something you need to do yourself. It might be something you might be able to let Libsyn handle for you. It really depends on a lot of other factors. One more question here that just came in from the chat room. Mike Wilkerson, again, said, how are episode-centric... Let me read this again. How are episode-centric episode images issued in Blueberry's WordPress process? So you do have the ability in most podcast apps to create and display an individual episode image. So for example, for the Audacity to podcast, well, I don't actually have one I can show you on my phone, but I make a unique image for every episode of the Audacity to podcast. I've been doing this now for a couple years. Depending on the podcast app you're using, you may or may not see that episode specific image. If you see the plain logo, which is now a black, red, white, and gray logo, that is then pulling from the RSS feed the show level image. Like Apple Podcasts right now still only displays the show level image at the single episode level. So if you press play on the episode inside of the Apple Podcast app, you won't see that nice episode specific image. Other apps, however, will display images. And they display those images, or they pull those images from different places. Overcast, for example, pulls from your ID3 tags. Desktop iTunes will pull, in certain cases, certain ways that you're looking at your content, it will pull from the ID3 tags. The Apple Podcast catalog, if you happen to search for something and it shows an individual episode, that pulls from your RSS feed. So the places that I really recommend that you have your individual episode specific images. First, in your ID3 tags for your MP3 file or whatever audio format you're making, put the image in there. There, it doesn't have to be the full 3000 by 3000. Try and keep the image smaller than 200 kilobytes or around 200K. Definitely don't make it any bigger than, I would say, 230 kilobytes because you need a little bit of room for some other stuff. But that can be then a 600 by 600. That could be a 1400 by 1400, whatever it takes to make that image that small file size for you. There, it's much more important that you have the right file size. That can go in your ID3 tags. So that's in the MP3 file itself. If you're using Blueberry as your media host, when you upload through PowerPress on your website, you have the option inside of the Blueberry settings to set they call them MP3 tags, and that can inherit certain information you enter in PowerPress. On the Libsyn side of things, you can upload your files already tagged with an ID3 editor, such as iTunes can do that, or there's ID3 editor from pa-software.com. That's my favorite one, works on Windows, Mac OS, and I think it also works on Linux, and it's really easy to use, very clean interface, has some nice time-saving features built into it. There is also mp3tag.de, and when you visit there, click on the British or American flag in the upper right corner so that you get the English version of the site. That's free, but that's Windows only. So you can upload your file to Libsyn with the ID3's tags already there. Or when you're in Libsyn in the publishing interface, you can tell it, take this information that I've entered in this episode post and embed that in the ID3 tags. The other place to do this is put it in your RSS feed for that individual episode or that item in the feed. And the way that you would do that inside of PowerPress is you need to go into the PowerPress settings under the, I believe it's the episode settings, and enable the option to see the iTunes image. That would enable the iTunes image field for each individual episode. So when you are adding your episode inside of PowerPress on your WordPress website, there will be that new field where you put in your MP3. Below that will be a field where you enter the URL for your episode image. Square image, it can be up to half a megabyte, maybe even a full megabyte at this point because of iOS 11. But I'd still recommend keeping it under half a megabyte for at least another year. And that would be your 1400 by 1400 up to 3000 by 3000 pixel image. On the Libsyn side of things, there's a very similar field. It's the episode artwork or artwork field, something like that, inside of Libsyn for when you're publishing there. And that allows you to do that same thing. It's attaching the image to the RSS feed. So that can then display in some of those apps. One last piece of advice I'll give you here. If you're making your individual episode images, make sure that your branding is consistent on them so that if someone is seeing those episode images, they'll know it's from your podcast. That might mean using the same colors, the same fonts, the same layout in some way. That's something that I changed more recently when I redesigned the logo I also redesigned the episode images. So now, as much as I don't like slapping a logo on everything, I slap the logo on almost all of the episode images that go out for my podcast episodes. So there's a logo in the lower left corner so you can always see that. And it makes it easy to post on Instagram and such. But I'm also using the same layout. The image is always in the same place. The title is always in the same place. The fonts are always the same. The colors change, but the layout and the look of it stays the same. And you can use design apps to help you do that kind of stuff. Even Adobe Spark Post soon will have some great ways that you can use some custom fonts. Already they have a nice branding feature, but you don't have full use of whatever fonts that you want. But that can be a way that you can make those images so that they look consistent. Or I've seen some people do certain things like they use the same color background and just shift and rescale things in a way that allows them to put a unique image in the center, or simply put the episode title in the center, so that your layout isn't really that different. It's simply what text is biggest changes. All right, that's it for now. Podcaster Society is open. You're able to join that if you're interested in making your podcast amazing and you want more access to me and other podcasting experts for asking your questions about interviewing, about sponsorships, about production, about search engine optimization, about legal issues, about being a guest on other podcasts, about how to best interview other podcasters, about production, about all kinds of things associated with your podcast. Then check out podcasterssociety.com. You must have launched a podcast in order to join Podcaster Society, because it's everything you need after episode 1. We won't help you launch. And if you haven't launched yet, then we're not for you yet. But if you're after episode 1, or maybe you're after episode 100, Podcaster Society could be for you to help you improve your podcast. Even if you're doing your podcast only for hobby, check out podcastersociety.com. Coming up on the Audacity to Podcast, episode 237, will be podcasting lessons from a binge listener. And episode then 238 will be certain things that you need to check if you're using your podcast feed from your media host, like Libsyn, Spreaker, Blueberry, even Audio Boom, SoundCloud, anything like that. Some things that you really need to check before you really rely on those services. So that's coming up, and much more over at theaudacitytopodcast.com. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Make sure that you subscribe, like, comment, review, whatever it takes on this video so that you receive notifications for when I do future live events, or simply join me Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live, and send your concise podcasting questions to feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.